This is an ACU Centre for Liturgy podcast. Speaking of liturgy. The best presiding ministers invite people to participate in the liturgy and pray well. Speaking of liturgy, Father Brian Nichols, Vice-Rector of Corpus Christi Seminary in Melbourne, Australia, and teacher of Liturgical and Sacramental Theology at Catholic Theological College, Melbourne, discusses the desired qualities of those who preside at liturgy and how to lead well and actively engage all participants.
Father Brian Nichols, welcome to Speaking of Liturgy. There's a very famous book now into its third edition called Liturgy with Style and Grace by Gabe Huck. These terms, style and grace, capture our imagination. Do you think they might have particular relevance when we think about the way liturgical leaders preside at prayer?
Yes, indeed they do. When applied to liturgy, I guess we have to remember that we're enacting ritual, sacramental ritual, so it's not a show, it's not a stage play, it's not pantomime or whatever. It's sacramental liturgical action, symbolic action. But style and grace are important from the point of view of leading people gently into prayer. Gabe Huck talks about this in his book, Liturgy with Style and Grace. He says the quality of our common prayer of liturgy can suffer not because we lack a theology or a spirituality, but because we don't do the human things very well. I think what he means by that is that, first of all, we have to come to terms with the incarnation. God is not a God who is out there. God is a God who is among us, particularly in Jesus Christ. So we make the power and presence of Christ a reality under sacramental signs and symbols and through ritual, through enacting symbolic action. So to do that with style and grace means that we do it with a deep sense of who we are as the church. Whether you are the presiding priest or whether you are a member of the assembly, we're called to somehow have a style that invites people into prayer. The grace part of it probably, I think, has a lot to do with the presider's part of being personable, not afraid to show his humanity, but also that he needs to remember he's not a show host, but nor is he a robot. So somewhere between those two extremes, we find ourselves helping people to come into prayer. And we do it by the very way we appear before people, our own knowledge of ourselves as a person, hopefully, our efforts to understand how Christ works in my life in order to be able to help people understand how Christ is working in their life. And while I would preside at liturgy by virtue of my ordination, acting, as we say, in the person of Christ, that doesn't mean that I lose my own personality or who I am as a person. I bring that with me to the celebration, but I need to do it in a way that doesn't reflect, or it doesn't at least emphasize me as a person as such, but my actions, the very style with which I celebrate, hopefully will lead people to a deeper understanding of the mysteries that we're there to enact.
So leading liturgical prayer involves knowledge and skill, but as you say, it also reveals your interior disposition. How important is this interior disposition, and how does it relate specifically to liturgical leadership?
Good question. I'm taken with, I can't remember who the author was, but I remember reading something about liturgical preaching once where the author said most people think that the priest prays in order to preach. But he turns it around and says, no, really, the preacher preaches in order to pray. In other words, the more we preach the gospel and enact the sacred mysteries, hopefully the more we are conformed to Christ. So interior disposition is really important. I think it was, in the post-synodal exhortation of Pope Benedict, he was able to invite us, if you like, into an understanding of the art of celebrating, ars celebrandi, but he actually enlarge that and use the words the art of proper celebration, which he says involves liturgical norms, a sense of the sacred, an appreciation of outward signs, the harmony of the rite, a liturgical vesture furnishing sacred space and architecture, and of course, due reference to the general instruction of the Roman Missal. So the art of proper celebration is not about enacting the rites strictly according to the rubrics, even though they're very important, because we can, as we know, we can celebrate according to the rubrics, but it can be a cold, uninviting celebration. What we do need to do, though, is to get behind those elements of celebration and be able to understand how they can lead us into a deeper appreciation of the mysteries we celebrate. From the point of view of the celebrant himself or the presiding priest, we obviously need to somehow live our lives according to the mysteries we celebrate. So the artful presiding, as Paul Turner would remind us in his book Ars Celebrandi, would include skills such as strong personal prayer, to be a person who has a habit of thanksgiving in their life, a person who's able to make sacrifice and serve the people, and also, he says, it presumes a Eucharistic theology consistent with the prayers and the rubrics of the Mass, and also, of course, the conduct of a priest's personal life. So all those human things come into it as well. We are called to be people who somehow live what we celebrate at the altar.
For a priest, presiding at liturgy is a vital part of ministry. So in your work, what do you look to develop when you are with clergy, including seminarians?
Firstly, I would say, as I probably learnt in Rome in a sort of indirect way at Sant Anselmo, is first of all to trust the rites. Trust what you're celebrating. So the only way to do that, of course, is to have a knowledge of the rites, to understand what this particular rite is trying to put across through ritual, symbolic action. So a trusting of the rites means that we somehow don't need to reinvent what we're doing, but we need to get the most out of what we do by understanding what we're doing. To look at the rite as it is, appreciate it for what it is, realize that there are probably greater minds than ours that have somehow put this rite together, and that we need to understand what was the intention of the Council Fathers when it came to the simplification of the rites at Vatican II, the active participation of the people of God, and the notion that the whole celebrating community makes the Eucharist happen. Obviously under the authority of the ordained minister who acts in the person of Christ, we understand that, but also that there's one presider, but there are many celebrants. Each of us plays our own part, a bit like we often hear the analogy of the orchestra, where we each play our own part and somehow we make the liturgy happen by the very task of entering into it.
Celebrating the liturgy well, of course, is a very admirable aim. We might think about the best presiding ministers. What are the main skills and attributes that you would associate with the best presiders?
I think the skills that they would need to acquire would be, first of all, as I said previously, to understand the rites. And one of the best ways to understand the rites is to take note of what the prenatanda or the introduction to the rites say. There's always a good theology and ecclesiology in the introduction to the rites. So, for example, the rite of baptism. We want to understand what baptism means, we read the prenatanda, the introduction. If we want to understand the rite of marriage, we do the same, or the order of funerals, or the rite of anointing of the sick. And most particularly when it comes to the Eucharist, the general instruction. It would seem to me as if a lot of priests perhaps have not read the general instruction, or have perhaps read parts that suit them and have decided to leave the other parts out that don't suit them. We need to see it as a whole and understand that the basic teaching, if you like, in the introduction to the rites enables us to see more clearly what follows in the actual words that are spoken, the ritual actions that are entered into, and the prayers that are prayed. So I would say the skills firstly would be to understand the rites, read the introduction, and know what the celebration's about. The attitude, of course, is one that would enable people to be actively engaged in the rites. So the priest, when celebrating the Eucharist, is not celebrating the Eucharist something between himself and God, but in fact he's celebrating on behalf of the believing community. So he must always take account of the fact that the liturgical celebration is about the church making itself the church, and therefore active, conscious and full participation is of the essence.
Many in the church, of course, are called to lead prayer and liturgy. Ministers, both ordained and lay, are called to undergo training, perhaps begin a whole new ministry. What tips would you offer anyone who is contemplating this role for the first time or seeking to improve their understanding and skills, especially a lay leader of prayer?
So for anyone contemplating perhaps taking on leadership in prayer in the parish, I think first of all, the pastor, the parish council, the liturgy team, or whomever would need, first of all, to somehow discern which people in the parish would have the skills and the leadership qualities necessary for leading public prayer. It's not for everybody. Many people don't feel comfortable speaking in public. So if that with the sort of person who is presenting themselves, you'd probably have to say, look, we probably have discerned you're not the right person. But the person needs also to discern themselves. What are they called to do? How au fait are they with, for example, the scriptures, the very particular tone, if you like, of liturgical praying as opposed to simply belonging to a prayer group or whatever, understanding the difference between liturgy and devotion, for example, and hopefully to be people who were looked up to in the parish as real leaders and people who possessed a particular spirituality and a very particular relationship to the rest of the community. It's not for everyone, but I think those who do lead prayer, lay people who lead prayer, need similar training to those who are ordained, because in fact they're carrying out a very similar role, not by virtue of ordination, but by virtue of their being a member of the baptized community. But the community themselves would need to discern who these people might be. If people put themselves forward, obviously they're not going to put themselves forward if they don't feel confident in getting up in front of people. But it has to be much more than that, because leadership and lay leadership of liturgical rites is very significant, very important, especially in this day and age when there is a shortage of priests, or at least where a priest is not available. We need people who are trained and very skilled at really inviting people into public prayer and leading it with a deep sense of what it means to be somebody who is helping people to pray and somebody who is helping people to enter into the mysteries over which they're presiding.
That was Father Brian Nichols discussing the art of presiding and the qualities associated with good liturgical leadership. The ACU Centre for Liturgy, which provides pastoral formation in liturgy across Australia and beyond, is pleased to provide this podcast, Speaking of Liturgy.